Hi, I'm very pleased to present to you Module 3 in the Patient Safety Curriculum, which is titled Identifying and Mitigating Patient Safety Risk. First off, I should start by saying I was thrilled to be asked to do this particular module because I've spent a good part of my life working in healthcare, but also more directly in patient safety, risk management, healthcare quality, and trying to understand the systems and the structures that really get in the way of providers feeling safe in their environment and of patients being guaranteed safe and effective care each time they seek care from us. My name is Barbara Youngberg. I'm a nurse by original training, social worker, and a lawyer, and I work currently as a visiting professor at the Beasley Institute of Health Law and Policy at Loyola University in Chicago. I also am responsible for online education for a program where we teach healthcare professionals about the legal and regulatory climate that so intrudes and so interferes often with their practice. I serve on the board of NPSF, and I'm thrilled that I have been able to, for the third year in a row now, serve as co-chairman of the annual Patient Safety Congress. In the course of my work as a patient safety professional, I've been fortunate enough to work with some really wonderful people who have taught me a lot about the work they've done in their own organizations. And I've authored numerous books and articles both on quality, safety, risk, and hospital operations. What I hope to do in this presentation today is really share with you both some of what I've been able to synthesize from what I've read, but I think perhaps, and maybe more importantly, some of the actual lessons I've learned in trying to create safe systems and structures within hospitals where I have been lucky enough to work with providers to do that. Obviously, there are some objectives that NPSF has established for this module, and hopefully upon completion of the module, you'll be able to identify effective methods for reporting near misses and medical errors. You'll be able to describe and recognize the relevance of state, federal, and regulatory reporting requirements and how they impact organizational performance. I think probably most of you would agree that sometimes these regulatory mandates are good because they force us to focus on things that maybe the organization doesn't recognize as priorities. But in some ways, I think that we let them get in the way of what we're really trying to do. And hopefully by the end of this session, I'll be able to give you some tips for how you might work with some of those reporting mandates as opposed to seeing them as completely separate. You'll also hopefully be able to explain prospective and retrospective techniques for analyzing system failures and vulnerabilities. I can tell you that in the work I've done with organizations, what I believe to be true is that the actual technique is sometimes less important than just the heartfelt effort and the diligence that some staff put into truly understanding every aspect of error. And so using a particular approach may not be as important as really working towards an outcome and then also committing to fixing what you find to be weaknesses. But we'll talk about of the most common prospective and retrospective techniques. And then finally, to interpret and apply best practices for analyzing data and driving patient safety improvements. As I mentioned, what I'm going to try to do throughout this presentation is give you some examples of things I've actually seen work in organizations that have implemented specific aspects of their patient safety program. I think the realities of reporting are clear to you as they are to me. And what is probably most noticeable to anybody working in healthcare is that there's no shortage of places where patient safety and error information is stored. And I think there has been a rise both in the public and private efforts to collect more data, perhaps to collect better data, and presumptively to collect this data in order to accelerate learning. Yet I think that you would all agree that many issues continue to exist surrounding data integrity and comparability, and they are as yet unresolved. And because of this, I think our learning has yet to be optimized. I'm sure that everyone listening to this tape has read the Institute of Medicine report that was released in 1999, and certainly one of the concerns that the drafters of that report raised was that the culture of learning in healthcare had yet to be established, and that there was still such a negative association with reporting and error that we were way behind the eight ball in trying to really understand what was going on in healthcare, and more importantly, why it was going on. And so the drafters of that report rightfully called for additional rigor to be added to systems to facilitate a culture of learning, to promote reporting, to focus on the system vulnerabilities that give rise to provider error. And so all of what we're going to be talking about today hopefully will get us to that point. As you all, I'm sure, know, there's many methods that are currently being used in healthcare for reporting. There are still a number of healthcare organizations that use legacy paper systems, and I think those have some real advantages. The disadvantages that I see in paper-based systems is often not in the paper itself, but in the fact that it's often very difficult, particularly given staffing crises that are existing in hospitals and in safety and risk management departments, to actually put the individual reports into a system where the data can be aggregated, tracked, and trended. And I think the real learning in an organization comes not from seeing these events one at a time, but from beginning to spot trends and patterns in the behavior. And so if you have a paper-based system, but you don't have the commitment to load it into a software package that allows for analysis, or if you put it off until you have time to do it, very often these paper-based systems don't accommodate really what is probably the greatest benefit from reporting. Often paper-based systems also include hotlines or some kind of promise for providers that they can just pick up a phone and let you know what's on their mind in terms of a specific event, so that those not wishing to complete a paper-based form can call an event in. Very often, and I think that this is probably still the culture in most organizations, physicians feel that reporting is really not something that they should be expected to do. Yet many will feel obliged to pick up the phone and call someone if something is on their mind, and particularly if a patient of theirs is injured, or if they feel like they want to report something that is impacting their practice. This event system sometimes is entered into a paper-based form, sometimes is not, and I think, again, the difficulty with the hotlines is that they often live outside whatever system the hospital has, so they're not incorporated into the data aggregation. And I think often what I have found is that often when you get these hotline calls, they come with the caveat from someone that either they want to remain anonymous, or they hope that it'll just be between you and the person they're talking to. And so this information at times can be actually held separate from the organization. That sometimes can mean that the most significant problems were the ones that actually were so serious that they prompted someone to pick up the phone and talk to someone, can be the ones that actually tell stories about events that live outside these systems. And so that, I think, is a risk. And then many organizations have migrated to web-based systems. And I would say of all the web-based systems, and there are many, they have varying level of sophistication. I think they have things about them that are really admirable, and some things that I think are potentially problematic. And we'll talk a bit about those also. Obviously, it is also apparent in the studies that have been done that the culture of an organization greatly influences the reporting culture of an organization. So if an organization is seen as punishing people who report errors, there might be a continued debate as to whether these reports should be anonymous or identified. Obviously, there's benefits, I would guess, to both. In anonymous reports, you might have people who feel freer to report, particularly if the culture is viewed to be somewhat punitive. But the disadvantage is you can't get feedback on those. You can't give feedbacks to people that file those reports. And also, it might be necessary to follow up with the individual so that you can really get a view and the perspective of the person closest to the event. As again, most of you, I'm sure, know, the literature supports the fact that it isn't necessarily the smartest people that can sort through these adverse events and near misses, but it's more likely to be the person that is the closest to the event, that might be in the environment or participating in a system that they know repeatedly sets providers and patients up for some kind of failure or error. So having the perspective of the individual, should you need to follow up, I think would raise a question as to whether anonymous versus identified reports are preferred. I think there's also, depending on the culture, this continued debate about whether you should really be pushing people to only report actual events versus near-miss reporting. Near-miss reporting, obviously, are those events that never reach a patient, never harm a patient, but I think are really gifts the organization is receiving to understand the vulnerabilities in their culture. I've heard in organizations that feel that they're understaffed and too busy, that they only really spend time to look at the actual events, and that they have piles and piles of reports in their office that they may never get to because they aren't deemed to be important enough. And I think that again is a really unfortunate perception of error reporting. I think that rather than looking at the outcome of an event, looking at all of the things that gave rise to a person feeling that a report was necessary can often allow you as a healthcare provider or a patient safety or risk management or quality person to actually get in front of an error before it hits patients. So I have found in my own practice that near-miss event analysis actually tells me a lot more about an organization and where to focus my efforts than those actual events, some of which are sentinel, but some of which also are very remote and isolated in their happening. So actual versus near-miss reporting, I think, often depends on this perception that we don't have time to look at the near-miss, and I would challenge you to the fact that only if you get a clear understanding of the near-miss reports will you actually be able to fix the culture proactively. There's also a debate about whether the person reporting should give you subjective information or objective information. Should you ask them just for what they've observed? Should you ask them to posit why certain things are the way they are? Should you request suggestions for improvement? I've heard organizations say we don't want people to think that if they give us a suggestion that we're automatically going to implement it. We also don't necessarily want that on the record because we don't want a lawyer or someone getting their hands on that and saying, well, it was suggested that you do thus and such, and because you didn't, that might expose you to greater liability. Again, I would say the people close to the event are probably the people who have some pretty good suggestions about how that event might be prevented in the future. And often people that aren't in the trenches just don't know the situation that intimately and can't provide what are often some of the simplest of solutions. So I think personally having a system where suggestions for improvement are encouraged, whether documented or not, really helps you get to the root cause of the problem much quicker. There is also this fundamental problem, and I think this has been in existence, actually was part of what the drafters of the IOM report spoke about, and that is this tension between whether the information which is collected needs to be protected or whether it should be broadly shared. I think that still in venues where medical liability is still highly problematic, there is this perception that information shouldn't be shared, but then the organization fails to maximize their learning. So there is this debate about whether even if you risk a bit of the protection that you might enjoy, if you finally fix the problem, maybe you'll have the luxury of being less worried about the legal problems and in the end. So this kind of tension continually between whether information needs to be protected or whether it needs to be broadly shared. And again, those that talk about the culture of safety and the culture of learning would say that the only way you really instill this culture into people is by being open and honest and talking about these things and being preoccupied with the failures in the organization so that everybody is equally committed to fix them. I think another cultural component of organizations around reporting is whether there's a willingness to share externally for purposes of benchmarking or a lack of willingness to do so. Certainly there are many organizations that recognize that unsafe culture and stories about the goings-on in a hospital can create some very difficult problems for an organization who might be competing against many other organizations in the community. But we'll talk toward the end of the presentation about both the benefits of benchmarking and maybe some of its limitations. Again, I think creating a learning culture, the organizations that I've worked with that have been most aggressive in trying to push a learning culture are constantly comparing their performance both against themselves but also against the people that they view as their most stiff competition. And there's a number of people that believe that unless you do this kind of external benchmarking, you'll never potentially get to best practices. Now again, the purpose of reporting, there's probably many purposes, but I would say the drafters of the IOM report were pretty clear that the lack of safety awareness was fueled historically by the often punitive approach that was taken by healthcare providers relative to error, and the traditional desire to punish what is termed the error operator. So it was easy to think you'd fixed a problem if you just got rid of the person who was at the sharp end of the problem. And what we've come to realize is that very often those people were just really victims of systems that really could not have supported them even if they desired. So looking at punishing an individual seldom solved the problem, although it did give organizations kind of a sense that they had done something. Ideally, the study and reporting of errors should be to promote learning, but I would say even now it is still difficult to separate error reporting from regulatory action or to prevent it from feeling or perhaps even actually being punitive. And again, I think that we'll talk a bit about how this, the way medicine is designed and the way it has actually unfolded with the intersection between regulatory and licensing agencies and with the mandatory reporting regulations in some states, that even though these systems are designed to promote a culture of learning, they often take on a punitive component as well. And I think it really makes providers still a bit suspicious about what the data is going to be used to do. I think that reporting for many people, the reason why people might cite not reporting is that it takes time and effort, and I think organizations have been particularly poor at creating a positive return on investment for reporting. So people might initially value reporting, but if they don't get any feedback, if they don't see changes made as a result of what's being reported, they soon realize that it's probably not worth the effort. And I think, again, for those of you that are responsible for creating these systems and trying to get staff to buy into them, the return on investment need not be financial, but rather supporting evidence that reporting can produce a system which is safer for both patients and providers. And creating that connection for providers particularly is essential. So giving them good feedback, actually being able to demonstrate that the information is used in a way to better the organization is very important. Examples of kind of the approaches that have been taken relative to reporting and perhaps some of the pushback that has been received. You might all recall that shortly after the release of the Institute of Medicine report, the Joint Commission attempted to launch a mandatory sentinel event reporting system. And they received an extraordinary backlash from hospital counsel, feeling that this mandatory sharing would erode the protection of information afforded under the attorney-client privilege, particularly in anticipation of litigation. So they were saying, in a sentinel event where a patient has a significant injury, we are likely to mark that case as being a potential medical liability claim. And once we so denote that that claim is such that we are given a heightened level of protection. But under our state laws, if we then share that information with anyone, we lose that ability to protect it. And so they fought quite vociferously about, excuse me, not sharing that information with the Joint Commission or with anyone for fear that that privilege would then be eroded. Others felt, and I think despite adamant statements to the contrary, that the Joint Commission would somehow use what was learned to impact accreditation decisions. And I think, again, this is both a problem or a perception that the Joint Commission has to deal with. I think it's also a perception that many state agencies have to deal with. They promote their error reporting efforts as being really designed to facilitate learning, but if certain things are reported, they also might result in state-based mandatory Department of Health visits or sanctions or something else that the organization can't help but feel is punitive. And so there is this, I'd say, less than enthusiastic response to some of these state-based reporting or mandatory reporting efforts, even though there is a great potential with a larger data set to have enormous and different learning come out of them. I think many of us also felt that the Patient Safety Organization or PSO legislation was going to solve some of these problems, and I think that it was initially thought to be one of the purest examples of a system that would promote learning through the collection of patient safety work product or error and near miss data. But as is currently the case, the protection is quite narrowly construed, and I think many healthcare providers and organizations still struggle with the definition of patient safety work product under that enabling legislation and find it to be so confusing that thus far the intent of the PSOs have not been fully realized. And I think that unfortunately the statute is what it is, but in an effort to try to really satisfy a lot of people who are critical of the legislation, I think some changes were made that have made that legislation less valuable than we might have hoped that it would be. Examples of internal reporting, and I think, again, we often are very black and white on what we think safety reporting is. It's that information that comes from incident or event reports, but certainly we can get a lot of information about systemic failure and patient safety events in the patient's medical records. We can get a lot of information through the patient complaint system. I already mentioned hotlines, and I think we can look at the traditional hotlines that are that exist between providers and the risk management office, but there's also patient complaint hotlines, there's compliance hotlines, there might be hotlines for employees to voice concerns about an organization, and any kind of situation where anonymous call-in information can be provided is also great fodder for aggregation of data to better understand safety problems. Chart abstracting or chart reviews that are primarily done when you're looking at adherence to best practices or evidence-based medicine are other areas or other ways that you can get some good information. And certainly on the risk management side, for years they have been looking at closed medical liability claims and abstracting those. And all of those provide credible sources of information, but I like to say the problem with this traditional data collection effort is that we collect to learn about errors and patient safety problems that have already happened, which to me is somewhat akin to driving forward by looking in the rearview mirror of a car. We wait until an event has occurred, we analyze it through that lens, and sometimes, depending on the hat we're wearing in the organization, it might limit our full understanding of an event. So if we're waiting, for example, for a serious event to occur, and then we're prepping our investigation for an eventual malpractice claim, we might be looking at those factors based on who we think is going to be named in the claim. We might be trying to look at the individuals or the error operator in that situation. We might not do a root cause analysis that fully exposes some of the systemic vulnerabilities. Similarly, if we're looking at at it from a quality standpoint, we might be looking at whether evidence-based practice was followed, but fail to appreciate some of the system problems that might have prevented evidence-based practice from being followed consistently. So I think, again, by always using data describing things that have already happened and then using it for a specific purpose, we not only are kind of closing the barn door after the horse has already left, but we're often causing or creating a much more limited analysis of the problem. I think creating a new data collection system or finding different ways to collect data in an organization is probably how you get started with this whole process of creating a culture of learning and analyzing data so that you can mitigate safety problems. And I think that were I to go into an organization and try to get them started with a data collection system, what I'd probably want to first do is first map where data is already being collected. You know, what kind of data is being collected? Where is it being stored? Is it stored in a manner that will allow for a periodic data dump into a master system? Ideally, you should have systems that speak to each other so that when you find a particular problem, perhaps on a particular unit, you can actually dig deeper into different data sets to maybe get a different perspective or a different view of that problem. The other question I would ask is whether the internal system functions as a feeder to satisfy external reporting mandates. Again, whenever possible, I think organizations should try to streamline their reporting efforts rather than making them overly complicated or redundant. Ideally, your goal should be to minimize the reporting burden for staff and to minimize the duplication of effort, while of course maximizing the benefit that all that data can yield in terms of better understanding the culture. So if you live in a state where you know certain things have to be reported, those should be developed as part of your day-to-day event reporting system, and they shouldn't be separate and additional elements that get collected. I think it just adds to confusion if you have redundant reporting or multiple layers of reporting in an organization. Again, I think some lessons to avoid, and these are things that I've certainly learned along the way in rolling out patient safety systems. I think that we all think that the more robust the data system is, or the data collection system is, the better it is. And I would say that what I found early on is that we have to resist the urge to collect everything. You really need to carefully balance what you need to know to advance safety in your organization with what your staff is willing to and has time to report. And I found that we spent often many months trying to create a perfect data collection system, and then found that staff just felt it was too cumbersome, or the kinds of information that we wanted was too difficult to collect. And so by trying to create something perfect, we actually disincentivized people from reporting. So carefully ask yourself, what do you need to know? And that can be going back to the question, what do you have to report to various external and regulatory agencies? And then what do I need to know as a leader in my organization to begin the problem, or to begin to solve the problem? Making the process for collecting as simple and streamlined as possible will really yield benefits in terms of the number of reports that you get. Non-intuitive computer-based systems or event reports with multiple text fields should be avoided. And again, I think that very often people, well-intentioned people that tend to be quite comfortable with computers have created some fancy programs. But if they're not intuitive for a clinician or someone of the age where using computers on a daily basis isn't a normal course of their business, they will get frustrated or intimidated. I also think that although there has been a great deal written about the value of storytelling in patient safety, I think the more text fields that you have in your error event reports, the more difficult it is going to be for you to aggregate data. And really the greatest learning is going to occur in this process through the aggregation of data, not by looking at each event one at a time. Ideally, I think data capture should be designed so that certain fields or choices are only available if appropriate. So if somehow you can create a system where certain most commonly associated root causes appear when an individual identifies a particular event type. That will not only begin to help steer their thinking about that event, but will likely make the reports more aggregatable, if you will. Once you get a data collection system underway, I think that allowing staff to tell the story can be helpful, but recognize that it can also make, as I've already said, the aggregation of data more complicated. If reporting systems include a large amount of narrative, you might want to consider mapping software or a system for finding common themes within the story. Which is certainly going to be necessary, particularly as you attempt to prioritize what things need to be fixed first or which things are the most critical. And again, whenever you have a lot of narrative, there's additional time at the back end that needs to be put in to actually extract the relevant learning, particularly when we're talking about the aggregation of data. And then finally, I can't say this more strongly, but recognize that near-miss reporting and the analysis of those reports can actually yield more and better information than can focusing only on actual or sentinel events. I think that organizations often fail to appreciate that a cluster of near-miss events almost always points to an event that eventually becomes sentinel. So having staff advise you of specific systemic failures over and over again without error can actually be a precursor to a very significant error that often does ultimately reach the patient. And certainly many healthcare providers can bear out stories that show that once they did see a really significant sentinel event and went back into their records, they could have predicted that that event would happen had they been more diligent in looking at these near misses. So take the time to not only analyze that, but to stress to your staff the importance of collecting information that could be problematic. And staff will, this culture of mindfulness that you will hear about a lot in this program, staff know when things are unsafe. Staff that are systemically mindful know when they are in a precarious situation with a patient. And if you can somehow convey to them that that information, once it gets to you, will be acted upon, you're going to get better information and certainly will be able to prevent downstream harm much more fully. I think that although many of us are growing weary of the many mandatory reports or the mandates for reporting by state, federal, and regulatory agencies, the good news is I think that in the quality and safety space, these external mandates can be helpful in forcing the organization to focus on quality and safety. So I guess I would say as a provider myself, it's sad that we require an external mandate to do what really is necessary to create safe and effective care for our patients. But the fact is that there are so many competing priorities in healthcare that often this whole idea of reporting and learning and creating a culture of learning loses its place in the ranking. And so these external mandates can often help to elevate the importance of that activity. I think the real problem with some of these reporting requirements, however, is that we don't get back from these agencies necessarily the aggregate learning that has been often promised. And regulation should not just be for regulation's sake. I think that although it might make it a priority for organizations in terms of reporting the information, there are many organizations that think just filing the report completes their obligation. And obviously, if you have an event in your organization that rises to the level of requiring reporting, it probably is significant enough for you to also look at as being a problem that needs to be resolved. And so I think that we sometimes get trapped in thinking, well, my outcome or what I need to do with this report is reported and then I've satisfied my responsibility, when in actuality that's really just the beginning. And then identifying if you have the choice of reporting efforts that are external or mandatory to engage in. I would always say pick the ones where there is some good learning coming out of them. And certainly some of the state-based programs are beginning to share some really good patient safety newsletters to give you a sense of not only what the problems are, but how to fix them. And those are the kinds of systems that are really going to help us get to where we need to be in this culture of safety space. Some examples of external reporting, and again, there's so many of them, and you probably are more familiar with them than I, but certainly many states now have state-based sentinel event reporting programs. The Joint Commission has very specific reporting mandates. You know that there is legislation now that supports the creation of patient safety organizations, and although this information is not mandatory, there are a lot of people encouraging this kind of reporting to create these federal-based data banks where safety can be studied truly in the aggregate. National Practitioner Data Bank reports contain a great deal of information, particularly about provider-specific behavior, but they can also lead to information that is informative about systems as well. Those of you that work in the regulatory or risk side know that the FDA, CMS, and others also have forms that have to be completed when events around devices occur, or perhaps when never events occur in the organization. And then the common formats created by the National Quality Forum are used really to create some kind of taxonomic structure for the patient safety organizations. So that when people do report information into a data repository that seeks to ultimately aggregate that data, that they're going to have data that is comparable because it's been collected with the same form. So the common formats have not been developed for every kind of event yet, but the National Quality Forum is certainly working to try to capture many of the most common safety and systemic events occurring in healthcare. I think the reality of these external reporting systems are that many of these systems still feel punitive, and many of them can and often do lead to regulatory action. I think some states have this dilemma if they are funding these error reporting initiatives with taxpayer money. They feel that when problems of an organization are identified, there needs to be the ability for the state to go in and fix those systems or to guarantee to the public that they have been fixed. So I think that we still have many organizations and providers that are skeptical about the external reporting, both the systems themselves, the ability of the people working in those systems to actually create and advance learning, but also I think they worry that there can be a punitive aftermath associated with reporting. Some of the systems fail to deliver on the learning which was promised, and I think that many organizations and states have told me that they're supposed to be getting this aggregate reporting, and they have data that's been reported for years, and they've yet to see a report that really does anything more than just add up the numbers of events. So they don't really lead to any solutions, or they don't give them the kind of information that really would help them fix their problems. I think another issue and another potential problem with the increase in external reporting mandates is that sometimes what's required may not be in the organization's list of priorities, and in fact it might not be an area where they have a lot of events, and it might force them to focus away from other and perhaps more important issues or concerns. The reality are with the current state of healthcare, we really don't have a lot of time to do things that aren't going to provide us with some benefits to our patients or to our practice. And so trying to find a way that we can identify the things that are going to yield the greatest benefit for our organizations is an important thing to consider. Within organizations, I mentioned there's a number of different sources of information, but there's also some different techniques that are commonly used by organizations for analyzing systemic failures. And these generally flow down from the event report that comes into an organization. The two most common techniques for analyzing systemic failures are the root cause analysis and the failure mode and effects criticality, sometimes called an effects criticality analysis, or just failure modes and effects analysis, or FMEA. Each has a very useful purpose, and I think you've probably done them in your organization, but they occur at different points in time on the error continuum. And I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of what I see as the use or the benefit of each of those, and then, of course, some of the limitations. Root cause analysis, if you look on the web or you look in many process improvement textbooks, has a lot of different definitions, and I like to think of it kind of as a structured approach to identifying the many factors that resulted in the nature, the magnitude, the location, and the timing of an outcome or of a harmful event, in order to identify what behaviors, inactions, or conditions need to be changed to prevent that event from recurring or similar harmful outcomes from occurring. So it's really, again, a retrospective process. You're getting a report or you're seeing an event that there has been a problem, that there has been a bad outcome, and the goal is to begin to dig into that event in a systematic way, in a structured way, so that you can truly understand the etiology of that error. A root cause analysis, as I mentioned, is generally performed after an error has occurred. So there's obviously some things about that that are not optimal. And an important limitation of root cause analysis as practiced by hospitals is that it often restricts attention, as implied by the Joint Commission policy, to sentinel events and near misses. This focus may leave many less severe events out of the picture. So again, the organization might spend an enormous amount of time on a catastrophic event that really has very little likelihood of occurring and miss the opportunity to do a deep dive or another kind of an analysis on events that might be more prevalent and actually more likely to lead to greater levels of harm. And I found it interesting in preparing for this lecture, an article written by Don Berwick in 2003. He argued against the use of root cause analysis since he believed the focus is often on finding a single source of error. But I think that many of the most credible RCAs that I've seen don't limit their ultimate finding to a single source of error. They really are trying to find all of the different potential causes of error in an organization and trying to address them equally. So I think that might be an issue more of how an organization performs a root cause analysis rather than what that type of analysis is actually capable of producing. I might also say that I think some of the limiting factors of a root cause analysis that I have seen in organizations is that very often these techniques or these tools are employed by the organizational experts or the people that might be in quality and in safety, and there's little thought or little attention provided to including the providers, the people closest to the event, the patients' families who might have been sitting in the room with the patient, to invite them into the discussion. Because those people are generally the people that really know much more about those particular processes on the particular day that the event occurred than might someone who has more formal training. And I think there's also this concern in organizations, and I think it can go both ways. Like, how deeply do you dig in a root cause analysis? I heard someone say once, and this stuck with me, perhaps because I teach in a Catholic university, but it says an appropriate rule of thumb for knowing how deeply you dig in conducting a root cause analysis is to dig until you reach the point of admitting something that is really embarrassing about the organization. but not go so far as to get you into the domain of theology. So you want to keep it where it's relevant to the organization and where people really start to feel uncomfortable about what you've uncovered. Things that everyone would know are not things to be proud of in the organization. And then you know that you've hit on something that probably really needs to be fixed. But don't make these things so esoteric and don't make them so complicated that people kind of lose energy in the process, or that you begin uncovering things that are really impossible to fix. Again, I think most of you know that the purpose of a root cause analysis is to move an organization away from focusing solely on identifying the individual or the error operator involved and then blaming them for the error, but rather to understand the systems and the factors that were present that set circumstances in motion, leading to an increased likelihood that that particular individual would fail. So it starts with an individual and identifying the situation in which they were in, but then it also looks carefully at all the different fixes or fail-safe methods that could have been put in place that might have prevented this person from having that type of event. Again, I think by definition, root causes are often described as specific or underlying causes. They're things that can reasonably be identified. So by just looking at an environment, by asking staff under the perfect situation, how might this have been averted, or what are the things that you think played into this event occurring? Root causes should be things that management has the control to fix. And so, again, you want to avoid getting too theoretical in these root cause analyses and getting to things that might be beyond the control of management or the organization. Root causes, hopefully, are those things for which effective recommendations for preventing recurrences can be generated. And again, I think that one of the things that I see in organizations that is troublesome to me is how much effort often goes into RCAs or root cause analysis or failure mode and effects analyses or deep dives where the outcome is almost just finishing the analysis, not actually solving the problem. And so I think that trying to, again, find a balance between how deep do you dig and in order to retain some energy to actually fix the problems at the end of the day is really an important question to ask your organization. And I'd say, what does it take for root cause analysis to be credible in the organization? And by credibility, I think that what you want to do is make these processes something that the staff feels can be trusted, that they feel are valuable. If you're going to ask them to participate, often you're going to ask them to take part in something that might be uncomfortable for them. So there needs to be some assurance to them that this process actually has some value and is credible. And so I think that clearly an organization should design these processes and show that they're very firmly supported by the leadership of the organization. They must be focused very carefully with processes, systems, and outcomes. So if the idea of trying to ferret out individual error operators becomes the focus, very soon people will lose interest in participating. That for many is just too uncomfortable. So needing to ask the questions about why is it this person failed, not how did they fail, but what were the things that were put in place by us that set this person to fail, is the way these kind of analyses should be oriented. Root cause analyses should be applied consistently and transparently according to organizational policies and procedures. So using them to appear to be holding a witch hunt against a particular department or service is not going to be helpful. And really always doing them in a way that is going to yield the greatest benefit for the entire organization is probably how I would make a determination about when to do these and how many of them to do. Obviously, again, we have this real problem in healthcare that people are already overworked, really needing to take additional time to care for their patients. And so if we're going to take time away from people at the bedside to participate in these activities, then we need to make sure that their time is well spent. And getting them to understand that by fixing these problems once and for all, you can actually find more time for them ultimately to be at the bedside is, I think, a good argument to make for people. What does it take then for a root cause analysis to be effective? I think that the best root cause analyses I've seen include not only the identification of the systemic problems, but also some development of actions aimed at improving those process and system problems. I think that ideally there should be an agreement as to how those improvements will be monitored and evaluated. You can't just put changes into a system and not measure that those are the right changes. I think organizations often find that the better they get at root cause analyses, the more accurate their ultimate conclusions and recommendations become. But certainly you want to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the solutions that are proposed. Having some kind of documentation, again, I think staff are much more inclined to believe that the process is credible if they see everything that was analyzed. If they're part of the process and they get to participate and witness the dialogue, I think that is also very helpful. Again, I mentioned I think it's really essential to engage everyone involved in the event, even though for some that might be uncomfortable, and certainly when we're talking about patients and family members, there might be a predisposition in the organization to not include them. But vital information is often missed if the people that are in the midst of the event don't have their perspective heard. So whether or not they are at the table with staff when the events are discussed is probably less important than making sure that someone seeks out information from them so that it can ultimately be incorporated into the analysis. And then obviously it has to gain the support of those who are responsible for making the changes. So at some point, those people need to be asked to vet the solutions that are being proposed, to validate that those are reasonable and acceptable solutions, and get on board with helping change the processes. Having great solutions that staff don't think are workable or don't think are relevant to their practice is going to mean that those things aren't going to ultimately become part of the culture. And that ultimately means that you've done all this work for nothing. And I think one approach to RCAs, I've heard this called questioning to the void, means to repeatedly ask, how is it so that something has happened? Simply don't ask why it happened, but rather, how is it that that was able to happen? And if you keep asking that question over and over again, you'll actually find that you're revealing additional layers of the problem. And that is really going to yield the kind of analysis that will ultimately solve that problem. Again, I mentioned the purpose of the root cause analysis needs to be to move the organization away from blaming or focusing on the error operator and being much more consistently focused on the systems that set that person up to fail. We know, and there's certainly plenty of research, plenty of error data that we have looked at in the aggregate that suggests that most errors result from faulty systems rather than from humans that are just poor at their jobs or making mistakes. Poorly designed processes that put people in situations where errors are more likely to be made are generally the kinds of things we can often fix. And so getting to the point where we have the intelligence to do that is essential if we're actually going to make any improvements. The other process I'm going to talk about briefly is the failure mode and effects analysis, and I mentioned that that is sometimes called the failure modes and effects criticality analysis. I think the real benefit of this process, in my mind, is that it is proactive. It seeks to try to identify certain failure modes or certain process issues that could set up a provider to fail, or could be, if you will, an accident waiting to happen. And when a process or a product or a service, a new service is being contemplated or designed, that's really when a failure modes and effects analysis should be deployed. getting staff to think about what if we open this service, and what if we see this kind of patient, and what if we offer this kind of treatment, what might be the things that we need to design up front to prevent an unintended outcome, really is a useful process. The problem, and I've already stated this at the beginning, the problem is that many people and organizations just aren't oriented towards this planning or forward thinking or really due diligence process. And so I think that many people, again, think that this is a lot of work without potentially the need for that work. And I think whenever an existing process or product or service is being applied in a new way, whenever a new process or product is being provided by the organization, there's probably some intelligence out there from other people or from similar kinds of services that can help identify potential failure modes, and then this process will just help organizations prospectively or proactively plan to control those. And it's really developing a control plan for a change process or for a high risk or newly modified process. The American Society of Quality, ASQ website, was a place where I visited again when I was just trying to get my thoughts around these issues, and I would recommend that website. It's just asq.org. They have a lot of slides and materials that teach you about specific quality process analysis tools. And I think that the benefit of ASQ is that it's a global community of experts who are leading authorities on quality in healthcare, but in other industries as well. And I think, again, something that I believe to be true, and certainly the drafters of the Institute of Medicine report were pretty adamant in their beliefs about, is that many things, particularly about failure modes and about potentials for failure, we can learn by studying other industries. Many industries that are high hazard like healthcare, that have multiple handoffs like healthcare, that have hierarchies like healthcare, have design systems that really help them overcome some of the vulnerabilities that those inherent systems support. And so learning from other industries and trying to study the way those industries analyze failure can be very helpful for healthcare. I think failure modes, FMEAs, are often very useful even after a service or a new product has launched, periodically to run through the life of the process, even in the absence of error, because as you know, there's a common problem called normalization of deviance, where we begin to start straying from policies and procedures or practices that have been in place to ensure safety, to try to cut corners, perhaps if staffing levels get cut or if the service gets busier. So you might be performing the initial FMEA in an ideal situation, and then 6 or 7 months when the service is much busier than anticipated, or the staff perhaps a little bit more weary, you might spot a number of new failure modes that need to be identified. So don't wait for an error to occur, but periodically use this kind of approach to begin to ferret out potential vulnerabilities in the systems that could give rise to error. Now again, all of this data is helpful both to create a culture of learning within an organization, but it can also be of great value as you attempt to benchmark your performance. And I think this idea of benchmarking has been touted as beneficial in healthcare for many years, but still there's still many questions about the value of using data to benchmark. I think in an ideal situation, benchmarking can help you gauge the progress of your organization, both relative to itself and relative to others after changes are instituted. It can assist an organization in understanding the range of performance levels that are possible. And I think that this is perhaps a bit more difficult if you're only internally benchmarking. So if you're only looking at your own organization's performance, and performance in a particular clinical specialty or area is not that good, or the patients are perhaps either very sick or not very sick, then you might not see the range of performance that would really help you set a stretch goal for yourself. You might never get to best performance. You might only get to the performance that's as good as you think you can get. And so there is some limitations in terms of understanding the range of performance if you're only internally benchmarking. The ultimate value is not just to rank order people based on who's best and who's not, but hopefully if you pick the right partners against which to benchmark, they'll be willing to share their best practices and offer you some strategies and techniques that might help you get to the targets that they have been able to achieve. So again, if you think of this activity less as being a ranking exercise and more as promoting this culture of learning and culture of sharing, it's going to actually have much greater value for the organization. Benchmarking, I've also seen, can help you focus on areas where there might be the greatest return on investment, either because you have the most ground to make up or because you already are doing things really well in a particular area that might be transferable to other areas in your own organization. So there's some great values, I think, in terms of using benchmarking as not just a tool to identify issues, but also to move an organization forward. Again, if you're just internally benchmarking or if you're starting with that, you're measuring your own progress over time. So you might do it month to month, quarter to quarter, rolling 12 months kind of benchmarking. What you're looking for is a steady improvement or progress over time. If you're externally benchmarking or comparing yourself to other organizations, you're looking for ways to demonstrate that your organization's excellence really is driven by specific processes and systems that you have in place, or conversely by identifying learning opportunities from organizations that are performing better in certain benchmarking studies. The caveat, and I'm sure this is obvious to all of you, in external benchmarking, it's imperative that data definition, the collection practices, and organizational complexity are all comparable. You can't just have people throwing disparate data elements into a pot and thinking that that's going to give you anything reasonable that you can benchmark against. And so it's important, if you're part of an external benchmarking collaborative, to feel pretty confident that the quality of the data and that the organizations against which you're being compared are organizations that have some similarities, or actually the benchmarking can be more harmful than it can be good. Again, getting the process started in benchmarking, I think understanding the limitations of self-reported data. So I would never recommend an organization just find value in benchmarking raw numbers. If you have an organization that has a very robust reporting culture, they might have 4 or 5 times the number of events, but actually most of those events could be near miss events that could demonstrate that this organization actually has a much better culture of mindfulness than an organization with fewer reports. So raw numbers can be complicated to understand in terms of their meaning. If you're benchmarking medical malpractice claims, and I think this is an area where hospitals often do some benchmarking, data on both indemnity and expense dollars probably need to be adjusted for geography to allow for the variation that exists from jurisdiction to jurisdiction depending on tort reform. And so, again, that's a very concrete example, but know the venues that you're benchmarking in. And if you're benchmarking across the nation or across multiple states, or you have hospitals in a system that are across multiple states, know that a dollar might not be worth a dollar in every hospital that you are looking at data from, and make sure that you control for that variability. And again, I think it's very important to carefully define the measures that you're seeking to benchmark. What's obvious or common practice to you may not be so to others. And again, I think that any of you that are doing benchmarking know that falls is a great example where we kind of all went into this thinking that falls would be fairly simple to benchmark, and find that very often organizations have completely different ways of defining a fall. They have completely different ways of tracking falls, and so the data collection at the front end can be essential to making sure that the back end results have legitimate meaning. Benchmarking, when done well, takes time and effort. And I would say a caveat again that I've learned is resist the urge to benchmark activities or processes that have no strategic significance for the organization. So doing any of these kinds of things that I've talked about in this program today, just to do them, really isn't wise for the organization. I think it causes fatigue. If there's no strategic significance, if the organization doesn't have a concern or doesn't have a problem or isn't stuck, isn't able to fix something themselves, then doing an external benchmarking collaborative might be very helpful. But if the organization already has a high level of confidence given their outcomes and maybe comparisons to national data that they have managed a service or a program very well, then it might not be appropriate, or it might not be necessary to take the time out to be part of some of these collaboratives. They can suck the energy and the time out of people. They can take resources that the organization probably could better deploy in areas where they do have problems. I think I would also say it's important to discuss with organizational leadership their commitment to address less than optimal results. Without a commitment to action, there really is also limited value to benchmarking. If you're going to go through a year of a benchmarking protocol only to have your leadership say, well, we don't really think the project was credible, or we don't think that the organization we were compared to has patients as sick as ours, then you probably shouldn't begin the exercise to begin with. So I think leadership needs to know that comparison is going to yield something, that if it's something negative about the organization has to make a firm commitment to address it further. I think it's also important in benchmarking collaboratives to discuss the philosophy for target setting. Is it realistic for an organization to always strive to be above average? Is it detrimental for an organization to be less than perfect? What are the goals you're trying to achieve? What do those metrics really tell you about the organization? And I think generally the broader the scope of measurement, the more difficult it is to align the measures for comparability. So I think that, maybe think about a project that has a fairly narrow scope initially. I think also it's important to get from the partners in the benchmarking collaborative a promise that this data is only going to be used to advance learning in the culture, that people are not going to use it for marketing purposes. So at the end of the study, you don't have people that say, we were doing this benchmarking collaborative with 6 of our competitors and we ended up on top. Probably having all participants sign a confidentiality agreement is an important thing to do in light of that. And I think ideally identifying partners to do external benchmarking with who have the same goals as you, which is to learn from truly the better performers. If you engage with someone who just wants bragging rights or wants to show you that they're the best but not tell you how they got there, then there's probably little value that you or your organization is going to get from that partner. So I think pick your partners carefully, pick your projects carefully, make sure that you know what is being collected, and make sure that what is being collected is really going to give you some ways to carefully identify your strengths and weaknesses. I think that Lucian Leap probably said it best in this area of safety. He says a lot of things probably that have inspired me in terms of my thinking, and he said that errors must be accepted not as evidence of system flaws, or as evidence of system flaws, not as character flaws. And certainly, again, one of the primary messages out of the IOM report is that we need to stop seeing errors as being the result of bad or inept or incompetent providers. But the only way we can really understand the systemness of these errors is by developing a more thorough reporting system and culture. Certainly what we all know in healthcare is that these systems that we have created are inordinately complex, and we're not going to fully understand them by quickly looking at them without digging deeper into trying to understand why they are the way they are and why they force people to act in a certain way. So starting with Dr. Leap's belief that we have to start with this fundamental belief that systems really need to be the primary area of focus is how we should begin this process. I think James Reason also said the systems approach is not about changing the human condition, but rather about changing the conditions under which humans work. And again, I think that really is a great guiding principle for how we design systems and structures to really get to the root cause of error and to create the appropriate fixes. I would add that I think errors can only be corrected if they are fully reported, fully understood, and most importantly, fully acted upon. With that, I've concluded this lecture. Hope it at least gave you some pause for thought in terms of not only some of the positive aspects of error reporting, but also perhaps some of the factors that we all need to think about as we jump into these systems, and that we need to be more mindful of in our own organizations as we help to design these systems. Again, the reporting structures are only as good as the people that act upon the information they learn. And so just creating a lot of complex reporting systems where people are still interacting with the data collected in the same way is probably not going to help an organization get to ultimately where they need to be. With that, I'd like to stop and hope that this all provided you with some pause for thought.